and there's a very close relationship initially between Samuel and Saul, which eventually falls apart, right? And then a close relationship between Samuel and David. Brian, you mentioned the next one that I think is prominent, and that is the prophet Nathan, who's close to David, but also it puts his neck on the line to call out David in his worst moment, right? The more likely outcome is that Nathan would have just gotten executed. He wouldn't have made it out of the throne room with his head attached to his torso. That would have been the most likely outcome. But in fact, God uses Nathan the prophet to rebuke David the king. Yeah.
I won't ask why, partially because I don't want the answer, but it does seem too that men really don't like to depend on other men for their day-to-day lives. Sure, when we get in a pickle, we certainly are happy to have somebody organize a barn raising and so that we now have a place to keep our cattle after the tornado took the old one down. But day to day, I like friends, but the idea of that I was not made to do life by myself is not an attractive notion.
Yeah. Yeah, what if David had a well-functioning accountability group of men that he was close to, and when he was tempted by Bathsheba on the roof of his palace, he went back to his guys and said, "Guys, help me, I committed a sin of lust today, help me to run away." Think about how things would have gone differently, right? We have lots and lots of interaction between the prophets Elijah and Elisha and Israel's kings. Most of it is pretty hostile, right? These prophets are against the king, for the king, for his own good, but King Ahab never takes it as a good, right? When they come against him. We have a really remarkable relationship between King Hezekiah, who's listed as a good king in the Bible, and the prophet Isaiah. Dig into that sometime. It's really interesting. The relationship between Jeremiah, who outlived a number of Israel's kings, as they were crashing toward exile, right? Only in the person of Jesus are the roles of prophet and priest and king fully united. I would say that's because he's the only one holy enough to handle the combination of those three roles in one person, right? So we could spend a lot of time looking at these relationships. We won't do that because we would just be here. We could be here for a long, long time. What are some takeaways? What are some applications to today of these relationships between the prophets and the kings in Israel's period of monarchy? It's easy to think of Old Testament history as so utterly detached from anything we experience in modern life. I want to encourage us to overcome that bias, if you will.
One thing that I recall, when you read like Jeremiah and Isaiah, and God's talking about all the false prophets,
yeah,
who are speaking words that tickle the ears and saying the things that people want to hear and going with the flow and fitting in and playing nice with the thoughts of the day. And then there's the prophet of God who speaks the truth that he hears from and they're always a stone in the shoe and getting thrown in the bottom of the miry pit and being mistreated and run out of town and hated upon. The truth is a very unpopular thing to say and to live by. You will rub against people going the other direction if you choose to live in the truth. And it will cost you.
Yeah.
But I think that's the reason our church has become so irrelevant. The American church, I mean not Heartland,
Sure.
has become so irrelevant is we're unwilling to say true things. We're unwilling to say this is what God thinks about marriage.
Yeah, right.
This is what God thinks about whether or not there are more than two genders. This is what God says about a man's role in his home.
Yeah.
But we have been unwilling to say these things, and consequently, we've become thoroughly irrelevant.
Right.
Tickling
Right.
ears instead of speaking the truth.
Yeah, that's one of the main criticisms of the false. There were lots of corrupt priests and false prophets in the Old Testament, right? Who were speaking in the name of God, but were not speaking for God. And yeah, the main criticism against them is they're tickling people's ears. They're telling people what they already wanted to hear. Yeah, that's exactly right.
In the business world, I think about what you just said, tickling people's ears reminds me of the term yes men.
Right, right.
You know, we don't want, if you run a business, you don't want a bunch of yes men
Yeah,
as your board.
yeah,
You need people that are willing to sharpen, willing to
yeah.
go in a different direction. And so it seems to me that in most every business arrangement, we've got a board of advisors around the leadership.
Yeah, you need people who are going to be willing to lovingly tell you the truth. I heard a quote this week that said the word for wife in Sanskrit is she who corrects her husband when he's wrong. So yeah. So we need people around us who are going to love us enough to sometimes be against us for our good, right? Yeah, that's whether that's on a board or in your home or in your cabinet of your president. All of these things, right? Good. We'll talk about Christendom in a few months, but I thought about this even in terms of. So let me give you an example. Christendom is has become kind of a dirty word. I think we'll try to reevaluate that word a little bit when we come to that period. It's this idea of the state and the church having a closer relationship. But I did think about even there are several times a year that I will put in a phone call to the Merritt County District Attorney and ask what's her opinion. I'd ask his opinion on something legal in terms of a counseling situation, or call the sheriff, the Merritt County Sheriff, and ask for his advice. And we've been really blessed to have a really good relationship with the district attorney's office and with the sheriff's office. And there was a period of time when the sheriff's office was inviting a pastor from our staff when they would go through a hiring process of hiring a new deputy to be on the hiring committee. And that's an informal, there's nothing formal about that, but it's an informal relationship between the church and the state that I think, at least in our context, has been really healthy. I appreciate that I can call, in our case, both of the DAs are conservative Catholics, but they share a similar worldview in terms of how they see the law and morality. And so we've been able to have a really fruitful relationship, and it's gone both ways. And the same thing with the sheriff. So this is kind of like a mini informal, it's not formalized in any, it's not codified in law, but this informal relationship that's been really helpful, that I think is more healthy for the community when the pastors are connected to the lawmakers, if you will. Many sitting presidents in U.S. history have had a close relationship with a pastor or a theologian who was an advisor to them on not just spiritual matters, not just personal matters, but also questions of, is this a just war or not? Is this a just policy or not? I think we have to say that there are particular skills that are required for political leadership that a theologian may not possess. He may have a really good knowledge of the Word of God, but maybe not skills for operating in the political arena. And that's okay, so that they can have different tasks, different jobs, but there can still be a fruitful relationship between a civic leader, a political leader, and a man of God who's helping him stay connected to biblical morality, biblical ethics. Does that make sense?
Would you say that's also be true whether that political leader is actually a true believer or not?
Yeah, I think if you have a political leader who respects the Judeo-Christian ethic, who maybe we wouldn't say is an evangelical believer, but has a respect or a value for the church, for Christianity. I think it's hard to not be a believer and then maintain biblical ethics, because what's it grounded in over time? But yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think our current governor is he's a conservative Catholic, right? I believe, but has, I think, a good relationship with yourself, with other evangelical believers. That is, I think, a fruitful relationship, right? Yeah. Other thoughts on this, on modern applications of this relationship between prophet and king. The prophet Nathan wasn't going to go out and lead the army out like David would. Nathan wasn't an expert in warfare, right? That wouldn't have been probably a good use of his giftings. But he had a really important friendship with David that he used for good, right?
I would say within the political leadership, my observation has been, as people have come and gone, I mean, leaders will pick people that, first of all, they implicitly trust, almost before their skill set. Mm-hmm. So as you see people get into office and gather people around them, it's almost more of, they know that they trust somebody that will actually advise them, versus the number one is your skill set, and then the opposite. I mean, that seems to be pretty true. Because there's been many times I've looked at people, it's like, what in the world are they doing there? Well, they've got a relationship.
Right. That has been true for all of human history, and it's never going to change. Right. Yeah. Yeah, so as we move into the New Testament, well, actually, let's save that for later. This is just, I wasn't sure where to fit this in, but it seems significant. So this falls under the category of differences between Israel and the pagan nations around them being on display for the nations. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. When we think of Israel as the people of God, under the reign of God, living out the faithfulness to God, or often unfaithfulness to God, in front of the watching eyes of the nation, think of the New Testament church. I'm not drawing theological equivalence between Israel and the church. I'm not going to get into that argument right now. But the New Testament church are the people of God, also living out their faith in front of every nation, every power, right? The church of God exists in every country. And the church is a universal kingdom embedded within the kingdoms of this world, right? So Zeke talked about this morning, how truly, this sounds naive at first, but I don't think it is. But we think, well, what power is there in worship? What power is there in just prayer, right? But honestly, truly, the most powerful tool that the church has politically is its worship, its prayer, its faithful living, living out the kingdom of God here and now in all kinds of different circumstances in front of a watching world. And Zeke talked about this morning how when Jesus lived and died and conquered death through his death, for the first 300 years of the church was this powerless minority, powerless in terms of earthly power. But through its witness, through the gospel, through living out this radically different community, this radically different kingdom called the church, they completely undermined Rome's ethic, Rome's morality, Rome's power was in a very subversive way. The church, being the church, undermined the power of Rome, such that the ethic of the empire eventually became far more Christian than it had been when Jesus was first crucified. Does that make sense? So their prayer, their worship, their loving one another radically changed society in a political way, in an actual political way. And you could make a case that where the church got into trouble is when it put down its Bible, put down its prayer book, and picked up Peter's sword again, right? And so we want to, we want to fight with the tools that the world fights with. But still and always the most powerful tools that the church has are the Word of God and the worship of God and prayer and loving one another faithfully and loving our neighbors faithfully. That is politically the most powerful weapons at our disposal.
Paul says that in his witness this morning, 1 Timothy chapter 2, very familiar verse, but it says, I urge you, first of all, to pray for all people. Ask God to help them, intercede on their behalf, and give thanks to them. Pray this way for kings and all who are in authority, so that we can live peaceful and quiet lives, marked by godliness and dignity. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants everyone to be saved and understand the truth. And I was just really struck by, in this particular translation, it says to intercede on their behalf.
Right.
Like,
this is Rome.
for our leadership that clearly aren't going to be praying themselves
right.
to a degree.
Right.
We are to actually bring them before
Right.
the throne.
Yeah.
Pray. You would hope that they would be praying for, but actually interceding
Yeah.
and doing the prayer.
Yeah. This is the same Rome who,
under Pilate, executed Jesus.
who would eventually execute Peter, who would eventually execute Paul, and 11 out of the 12 disciples, and the 12th one would be imprisoned. This is a radically different approach to subverting the empire. But history is full of violent revolutions that overthrow a tyrant and then put on the tyrant's boots, right? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right? There's nothing more tired in history than revolutionaries who, fighting injustice, pick up the sword, then develop a taste for blood, and then become the tyrants themselves in the next generation. That's repeated over and over. Jesus was the most brilliant political person who ever lived, right? Because he created it.
Jesus knew
You're never going to overcome evil with evil. You're not going to overcome the sword with the sword. If you're going to truly overcome evil and undermine evil, you have to overcome evil with good, right? And so we follow the model of Jesus who subverted, who won by dying. That is actually our model. Victory is going to come through suffering, not through a sword, right? Thoughts on that? That's a lot. Romans 13. So Mark quoted 1 Peter 2. Romans 13 is a very similar sentiment, right? I had conversations. We don't have any Chinese students in here this morning? I don't think we do. I had conversations with 20-something
Chinese students who were becoming believers
and wrestling with politics. Like, what do you encourage? I see China very much like Rome. Like, they can't go protest. They can't hold up. Or you can. So you can do anything for about half an hour in China. But it's not going to last very long. How would you advise a 20-something Chinese believer who's frustrated with the injustice of his government? Do you encourage him to take up arms and attempt a violent overthrow of the Chinese government? I wouldn't. And that's not what Peter and Paul recommend, living under pretty similar circumstances, right? If the Chinese empire is going to be undermined, it's going to be done by the gospel, by faithful lives of an ever-growing number of Chinese believers living out
the community of the church in front
of pagan rulers who are converted by this radically different life that they see lived out in front of them.
But Paul also had the opportunity to sit in front of leadership
Yeah.
and publicly proclaim
Yeah.
the gospel as well.
Yeah, so we want Christians to run for the highest offices of the United States, presidency, Supreme Court. We want Christians to run for governor. We want them to run for our local school board and our local board of supervisors, right? That's all good. If we want people who embrace those callings as believers. It's not in tension with or not in opposition to faithfully living our ordinary lives as well, right? Yeah, Newton.
Would you say that praying against our oppressors, even using some of the words of the Psalms,
Yeah.
praying against them, is that just a spiritual way of cursing them?
Sometimes I like to pray, like, God, either change this person's heart and bring them to you, or if you know that's not going to happen, then remove them from this, disable them from doing their evil. I think that's an appropriate, under a gospel age, I think that's an appropriate thing to pray. The imprecatory psalms are still inspired psalms, right?
Does that count as praying for the president?
Well, yes, yeah. It has to, right?
So Bonhoeffer.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about Bonhoeffer when we get there. For those of you who don't know, Bonhoeffer was a theologian who was executed for attempting an assassination of Hitler.
Former pacifist.
Yeah. Pastor, theologian, got involved in a plot to execute Hitler. I think Hitler is a pretty unique situation. But we'll talk about that when we get there. Yeah. I don't know if he was actually praying for Hitler as he was also plotting to kill him. I don't know. He probably was, actually, knowing Bonhoeffer. Okay, we got sidetracked there. Israel's concept of war. How is Israel's concept of war radically different from the concept of warfare for the pagan nations around them? I would argue this is consistent from the time that they come out of Egypt all the way through the exile.
Something like, Lord, your enemies are our enemies.
Mm-hmm. So let's preface this first. It is important to have some means of defending those who you have been given to defend, right? So God has put me in charge of my home. He's charged me with protecting the people who live in my home, right? That's self-defense is a legitimate activity if your neighbors want to kill you, and this was true for Israel, whose neighbors wanted to kill them. And yet they still had a very different concept of warfare. So they were not allowed to set up a permanent standing army. You'll notice this if you read through the Old Testament. And times when they did try to take a census, which was almost always for military purposes, that almost always got them in trouble. Who did they look to for their security ultimately? They're continually encouraged to think of God as their first defense and their last defense, right? So what are some ways we see this play out? Start at the very beginning of their nation's history, coming out of Egypt. How do they defeat Pharaoh? Yeah, God does it, right? They do what God has asked them to do, and actually initially it goes worse for them, right? Pharaoh's like, make more bricks, and now I'm not going to provide you with any straw. But ultimately, God defeats Pharaoh. God humiliates Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh finally lets them go, and they head to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh changes his mind. And how's Pharaoh's army wiped out? Right? It's an act of God. We see this all the way through. The defeat of Pharaoh's army at the Red Sea is God's doing. Moses, how does he? The first time they come under serious threat as they're in the wilderness is the Amalekites. How does Moses defeat them? by holding up his arms, and then his buddies helping him hold up his arms when his arm gets too tired, right? Of course, they do have an army out there fighting also, but the whole point is it's not Moses's military skill that's winning this victory. It's God that's winning their victory. How do they defeat Jericho when they get into the Promised Land? With a really good marching band, with a great horn section, right? Led by who? The priests, right? And then they come up against this tiny little town called Ai, who should be a cakewalk. And what happens? They lose militarily, right? Because of Achan's sin. And then how do they defeat the Amorites? God intervenes with this miraculous act on their behalf. And then we see this massive threat in the time of the kings. Jerusalem surrounded by Assyria. And how do they defeat Assyria? God defeats Assyria for them, right? While they are inside their walls praying. What's the point? How is this different from how the nations thought about warfare? They really did, or God really tried to help them believe that He is sovereign over the rise and fall of nations and militaries, that ultimately your security is not in your horses and your chariots. Ultimately, truly, your security is in God, right?
How does that cross over? I mean, Israel was God's chosen people.
Yeah.
And so, the United States, we're not God's chosen people per se.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have people within the country that believe in God, but how does that?
Yeah,
How do you mesh that?
I think that's something we really have to wrestle out. I think we need to take more seriously. Believers do, at least. Right? You can't expect 5-star general so-and-so who doesn't believe in God. I mean, he's got a job to do, and it's to equip America's military to kill people and break things when he needs to, right? That's what the military is for. But I think as believers, there's more to the story than that, right? And I think we do have to think theologically about, to think biblically about, what is the role of force? You mentioned 1 Peter 2 and Romans 13, both which talk about the government has, okay. 1 Peter 2 also talks about the government bears the sword. That appears to be a legitimate exercise of the government, is to carry a sword, right? It is the job of the leadership of the United States to protect the people of the United States, right? But where is that line where we tip over from being? It's a question to wrestle out. I'm not sure there's easy answers to it, but. Other thoughts on that? I think this is true for believers, right? God ultimately fights our battles, right? We don't have to. Somebody said, I think this is theological. This is not a verse from the Bible. Trust God and keep your powder dry. If you heard that phrase, trusting God and then being responsible for the things that you are given to protect, right? I think those are both biblical ideas. But we repeatedly get this theme through the Old Testament, and even into the New Testament. Jesus entrusted himself to God, right? Even when he was killed, right?
Day to day, I find it easier and more to my liking to keep my powder dry than to trust God.
Right. Right.
I mean, to trust an invisible being.
Right. Yeah.
This, I think, is the theme of Hebrews, that the real things are the invisible things,
Mm-hmm.
and the physical things that we think cast a shadow are in fact only a shadow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It does not.
Yeah, it's the fight of faith. That's what the Christian life is, right? Yeah. Okay, that was just an aside. So we talked about the transition from Israel's going to move from being a monarchy, so under a series of kings, and then eventually Israel's monarchy is going to become so corrupt that God, in love, sends them into exile, right? As his son, Israel, his son. I think this is these are instructive principles for our current moment, right? Because we have lived under a governmental system that's been, you could make some arguments about how much the original founders were genuinely believers. Some were, some weren't. But we certainly have lived for 200 and some years in a country that was more friendly to Christian principles and is becoming increasingly less so, and in an accelerating sense, right? What does it look like to be faithful in a time in which your country is on a long slide, apparently towards self-destruction, right? That was the experience of Israel, and I think that's where most of us feel like we find ourselves at the current moment in our own nation, right? Is that fair to say? And again, I think it's instructive for our current moment. A time when the government officially is friendly to Christianity. You could say that's the monarchy under David and Solomon to a certain extent, even though they were far from perfect. But then slides into a long cycles of unfaithfulness, and now more or less run by pagans, right? What is the role of God's people under such circumstances? I think that's what a lot of us are wrestling with, trying to figure out right now, right? I don't think there's a better example than the person of Daniel in the Old Testament. And we will probably spend a whole morning looking at Daniel. So maybe we'll just introduce Daniel this week. What were some things unique about Daniel?
I think his environment was always, he was not in he was basically captive, right?
Yeah, he was dragged away from his home, probably most of his friends and family killed by Babylon, dragged off into exile as a very young man, right? Probably as a teenager, yeah.
Considered a very bright individual.
Right.
People saw him as an up-and-coming.
Right. So his whole life he was involved in politics, right? He had a career in politics. Now that career had ups and downs, some serious ups and some serious downs. Right? There were times when he was placed as second in command of the empire, and then by the time we get to Belshazzar, he's been completely put on a shelf collecting dust, right? It's like Belshazzar was a Pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph, right? Who knew not Daniel. But then it looks like his career is over, and then he gets brought back to a place of political influence under Darius, right? So his political career has major swings, but his spiritual life is rock solid all the way through, right? So I think we'll save that. Yeah, I think we'll save that for next time. Jeremiah 29 is a passage that's often spoken of. Jeremiah is the prophet who's the last major prophet before they head into the exile. And in fact, his prophetic ministry carries into the exile, right? He's prophesying the fall of Israel, and then it actually happens, and he is still alive, and he's still prophesying, and he writes a letter to the exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon, and he tells the exiles how to conduct themselves under the pagan regime of Babylon, and how to do that faithfully. The people he writes to are never going to live to see, they're 70-year exile, right? They're not going to live long enough to see the return, right? And what does he tell them to do? Basically to start little Edens, right? Carve out for yourself, to the best that God helps you to do, to carve out for yourself little gardens of Eden in exile, right? It's the same thing, I would argue, that the church is called to do today, regardless of which direction the political winds are blowing, regardless of whether the people we support are winning elections or losing elections. We're still called to the same faithfulness, right? Thoughts on that? Yeah, Levi.
I think we can learn a lot from our brothers and sisters in China. One of my friends is a Chinese believer, and I was asking him about his government and how badly they mishandled COVID and everything like that. And he had no fear. He was not worried about it at all. He acknowledged that his government was not doing a good job, but it was such a secondary issue to him because he has to live in the reality that my government's not going to change, and that doesn't mean that God is not in control.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, like you were talking about at the beginning of this class, of where do you view government as everything or nothing? I felt like he had a healthier view of government than I did, just because he saw God's sovereignty in a place that it's not easy to see God running the government in China.
Yeah.
But the church in China has adapted really well, and the church is doing really well in China, even though it's way more difficult for them to gather than it is for us.
Yeah. And the conditions under which they live and under which Paul and Peter lived are much more standard for human history than what we've experienced the last 200 years in American history, right?
And I think it all depends on your expectations too. We expect, it's kind of like if you're out in the middle of an ocean on a ship that only has certain supplies, would you be asking for canola or Burger King? No, you wouldn't even expect it. You would just know you had that certain food, a certain water, and you would just expect. And you'd be thankful for that. We, on the other hand, have all the amenities, all the everything, and we kind of want our government, we want them to be different. We want better choices to be made, and they're not making them, and it's frustrating. And so
I think we should want our governments to follow God's law, and we should work to the best of our ability to encourage that, and we should encourage our church members to be involved in, to the extent that God has gifted them in those areas, to be involved in politics. That's a legitimate calling. Daniel is the perfect example, right? He rose to nearly the highest position. Joseph, right? He rose to nearly the highest position in Egypt, and he was governing. The Pharaoh put him in charge of governing the actual country, and Joseph and Daniel did that with incredible skill. And we should want that. We should want our government to run well. We should want it to run on godly principles. But ultimately, we can't make that happen. And ultimately, God is sovereign, right?
And no one person can make that happen.
Yeah, no one person can. One person can screw a lot of stuff up really fast, but it's hard for one person to fix everything, right? Except, well, there was one person, but yeah, he's still in charge. Right?
What's fascinating about Jeremiah, though, is that, I mean, it's very much against the bunker mentality.
It is, yeah.
Very much. And we look out, I mean, I look at when we raised our kids, and I look at my grandkids, and there's always, I'm sure a fear of every generation looking forward as the world seems to be spiraling down. But one of the main parts of that passage is find spouses, marry, so that you have grandchildren. So it wasn't even just first generation.
You're thinking
There's
generationally.
multiple generations involved, and work for the peace and prosperity of the city. I mean, there's very much go out, engage.
Yeah.
While in exile. I mean, that just seems so contrary to just preservation.
Yeah, it wasn't just let's hunker down in our bunker with our military rations and then wait it out. He was out there engaged at the highest levels of government, right? Daniel was, I'm thinking here. Yeah. Yeah, I think there was we'll look at this more later, but there was a period of U.S. church history where goes by certain names, but where the impulse was to, just bunker down and disengage from society, and I don't believe that's the picture that's offered to us in the Old Testament or the New Testament, right? Jesus actually engaged with Pilate. He engaged with Herod. Paul did the same, right? Paul engaged with Herod. Paul wanted to go to Rome because that was the power center.
The thing I can't help but think about is how, as far as prophecy, God told Abraham that they would go and be slaves in Egypt. So God told Moses that people would not follow his law and that they would be taken into captivity. And Jeremiah, God told the people they'd be in captivity 7 years. And I think we forget that God has told us the end of the story, that Christ wins. He tells us that things will go from bad to worse. But we are called, our commission is not to try to fix everything. Our commission is to be faithful to Christ, to make disciples of all nations, to be willing to die for Christ because he died for us, and to live that radical life of love and forgiveness because that's what Christ did for us. And so I think we forget that when we get caught up in trying to change things. When, yes, I think we should seek to use the influence we have, but I think when we lose sight of the end of the story, it's not us fixing the world's problems, but we're called to be faithful in our realms of influence.
Yeah.
And the story will play out, and we have a role to play. But it's a gift of grace, and that's where change can happen when we are seeking to be instruments in God's hands for change and not seeking to make the change.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think it's also an antidote against despair, right? It'd be easy to despair, to look around at our politics and despair. And I don't think despair is a Christian impulse. It's not a faithful impulse, right? Mourning and grief are, right? There's a book of Lamentations, which is lamenting the exile, right? The destruction that they had brought upon themselves, right? So lament for sure, but not despair. There's a difference between lament and despair, right? You lament when you see genuinely bad things happening. You despair when you don't know the end of the story, right? Any final thoughts? All right. JJ, would you close us in prayer?